as a research associate in energy economics and policy with the Sesame project co-funded by the European Commission, and also studied in the US during his PhD. He's advised international organisations like the World Bank, the European Commission, the Northern Irish Utility Regulator, and the German Federal Network Agency in the past. His research areas include energy economics and policy, industrial organisation of electricity and gas markets, and environmental economics and policy. All really key issues for the future of the territory and very topical at the moment with the development of the region as such so important. So welcome and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for your kind introduction, and thank you also very much for providing this lovely platform to disseminate my research findings. So I welcome you all I welcome all of you here, and I know that these are the busy days again started, so I really appreciate your time and effort. I hope that by the end of this presentation you will learn something about the territory market that has been relentlessly serving population since the 1980s. So the title of my talk today is Small Energy Markets, Scattered Net Regulatory Reforms, to put this with regards to the reforms that the territory embarked in since 2014, right? So there is a big underlying picture behind this particular research area, because energy market reforms is not a new topic. I mean, it has been happening since the early 1990s, and a lot of markets now globally are undergoing a period of introspection on the impact of reforms. I mean, whether reforms have been successful or not, did it deliver its promises, and so forth. If we look at some real-world examples, countries in South America like Venezuela, Dominican Republic, they have gone back again to the state from the market. And the UK, for example, which is considered to be one of the pioneers of modern-day electricity reform, I mean, it also signaled a significant government intervention in its market operation in 2012. So, considering this global development, NT since 2012 started this nice little experiment in the territory, right, about introducing market-based reforms. So this event certainly provides opportunities for energy economists and policy makers like me to actually revisit reform drivers, context, steps, and future pathways for the electricity market. Now, this presentation today is based on a discussion paper with Professor Flavio Menezes from the School of Economics at the University of Queensland. He is also the current Deputy Director of the Queensland Competition Authority. So any questions pertaining regulatory economics, I suggest you all to have a double think about it. So this research was funded by the Search and Visitors Funding Scheme at the School of Economics of the University of Queensland. All right, so with a bit of the background, this is the structure of my talk today. I'll talk about the different drivers of reforms, more generally in the global context and more so in the Australian context, right? And then how did Australia respond to these different reform drivers? The NT context, what's the gap in the literature? Why is the study interesting, and what does it contribute towards advancing the knowledge in energy, economics, and policy and reforms? I will then compare different aspects of wholesale and retail markets, operation of the NT market with other mature and larger markets in Australia, such as the national electricity market serving the eastern jurisdictions and the Western Australia market in serving the Western Australia, right? And obviously I recommend different future pathways as policy options, what needs to be done, how can we move forward considering the NT context. And of course, I'll conclude, and to be ethical on my research, I will certainly highlight the references that I have used for this study. All right. So the driver of reforms, they are very much aligned with the energy policy objectives of affordability, of energy affordability, that is delivering low cost energy to the consumers, environmental sustainability, right, and security of supply, that is the ability of the system to make energy available at all times when people need it, right? So the first and foremost is to enhance efficiency and sustainability of the sector. When we say efficiency, there are two aspects to it. One is the operational efficiency, where we look at plant level operations and the amount of transmission and distribution losses that happens in the grid, right, when electricity is transported from its source to the distribution center via a long high voltage transmission line, is so to speak, right? And then at the distribution center, the electricity that's transported actually it changes its voltage level, and then you have the distribution lines that transports it through the households and so forth. Okay, so yes, and the other aspects of operational efficiency is to maintain system reliability, maintain adequate capacity, and more so importantly to actually increase energy access. And on the other hand, we have the economic efficiency, which is all about low-cost generation, useful and effective investments. Okay, so the investments, in particular, that happens in the transmission and distribution networks, which are really capital intensive. We need to make sure that they are useful as well as effective, right? And then removing subsidies, which is all about removing price regulation, because at the end of the day, we are talking about market-based reform. So let the market determine its outcome and nothing else, okay? So, and the next driver is about enhancing environmental sustainability, which is the need to decarbonize electricity generation as well as consumption, and also improving energy efficiency, right? And the most important of all, lowering the cost of electricity used to consumers, which is about increasing energy affordability. For example, as we are all aware, rising electricity prices has been a major problem in Australia throughout since 2008, and so electricity prices have, increased by more than 61% from 2008 to 2014, despite drop in energy usage. Now that's a big concern. And what is this indeed doing is this is forcing people into energy poverty, which is like a typical household spends more than 10% of its annual income on meeting the electricity bills, for example. Okay, that's the
and a number of those markets have actually already been reformed. Like Southeast Queensland, for example, that's been reformed. One of the arguments for reform is actually to decrease costs, improve efficiency, etc. Wouldn't you suggest that the reformation hasn't been successful?
Yes, I would suggest so, and this has also happened in the case of Western Australia, as we will trace later on, because Western Australia introduced a wholesale market in 2006, but the market didn't deliver what was anticipated, and they came with a major overhaul of their market in 2014. They launched this. Yeah, okay, great. So essentially, we're talking about, impossible trinity of security of supply, environmental sustainability, and low-cost energy. For example, there are trade-offs. When we improve reliability, that also means we increase the cost. Now, how can we at the same time deliver low-cost energy to consumers? So there is a big debate among policymakers. Are these energy policy goals all about an impossible trinity? I will not be able to answer that question today, but that's a food for thought, okay? So, all right, so Australia basically joined the reform bandwagon that was happening globally in the early 1990s as well. So in 1994, the Victorian Power Exchange started operating. This was followed by an unbundling, which is the vertical separation of transmission from generation, and a market was launched in New South Wales, right, in 1996. In 1997, South Australia followed suit by undertaking accounting unbundling, as well as early corporatization efforts in 1995. And eventually, Queensland mimicked the reforms that took place in New South Wales in 1998, and the 1998 saw the establishment of the world's most transparent energy-only wholesale market in the eastern jurisdictions of Australia, which we name it as the national electricity market. Okay, so initially in 1998, Tasmania wasn't participating in that market, but since 2005, Tasmania has also been participating in that market, right? And if we look at Western Australia, basically followed what happened in the eastern jurisdictions of Australia. In 2006, the wholesale electricity market commenced its operation in September. And then, so what the reforms meant was basically the vertical separation of then vertically integrated and state-owned electricity utility Western Power Corporation into 4 separate state-owned entities: Verve Energy for generation, Western Power for networks, transmission and distribution, Synergy for retail sales, and Horizon Power as a separate entity to supply states regional power. Okay, and in 2006, the Western Australia market created an independent market operator and regulator. Okay. However, the reforms didn't deliver what was anticipated. Things didn't work in Western Australia, as I'm not surprised. Okay, so what happened in March 2014 was they launched a major review of their electricity market, so which was phase 1 of the electricity market review, commenced then on March 6, 2014. So this review basically focused on reducing cost of production and supply of electricity and electricity related services without compromising safe and reliable supply. And phase 2 of the electricity market review in Western Australia commenced on 24 March 2015. And this aims to give effect to government's preferred reform options to achieve the electricity market review objectives. Okay, and then the last but not the least, the electricity market reform in NT. So in 2000, NT government initiated the reform process with the establishment of the Utilities Commission. However, that was the initial signal to actually reform the electricity market in NT by establishing the Utilities Commission, right? So in 2012, the government decided to improve the efficiency of Power and Water Corporation, and eventually what that meant was in July 2014, Power and Water Corporation was split into, which we call vertical separation, right? Split into territory generation. We have some representatives from territory generation, so if you guys have any questions, please cast them. All right, and then Power and Water, which is responsible for the networks. And then Jacana Energy, we now know whom we are paying our bills to, right? I mean, we get a bill with Jacana Energy listed as our retailer. So this separation happened in accounting and legal terms. And until then, the Power and Water Corporation was operating as a state-owned, vertically integrated entity from 1980s till 2014. So now the reforms are ongoing. This is just the beginning, right? They are ongoing. So in 2015, it was decided that the responsibility of economic regulation, which was previously handled by the Utilities Commission, be transferred to the national framework, which is the Australian Energy Regulator. So the idea here is to actually harmonize the local rules and laws that existing at the national level. So that's the idea. Now, whether that's good or bad, whether this shifting of burden from the local context to the national context is good or bad, that needs another set of study. But there is a question to think about, okay? And eventually in 2015, NT commenced operating the interim Northern Territory electricity market, which is some sort of a wholesale electricity market, okay? So it's an interim market. So there are milestones to be achieved in the transition towards a full wholesale electricity market in the territory. Now, what are the different properties of this interim territorial electricity market? Where are the flaws? Those are the issues we'll be picking up as we move on. But for now, let me show you how the market operates, okay? So you have the generators at one end who generate power, then you have the retailers who basically contract with the consumers, okay? So any consumer can purchase, well, any consumer can sign a contract with any licensed retailer, okay? So the retail market is open, especially in Darwin and Catherine, I think, since 2015 and 2014 or so, for small consumers, right? So, and you have a system controller and the market operator. Both of these functions are now being handled by power and water, am I right? Like, yes, so, I mean, is this, and the idea is the generation market is open, I believe, so in theory, right? So any independent power producers, if he or she wishes to generate power and sign generate power and deliver it to the consumers, it has to be done through system controller, and which is obviously power and water and so forth. So what I'm trying to say here is there are no provisions yet for any independent power producers to sign direct contracts with consumers, okay? So now, yeah, so this is the current state of the market, okay? Now, whether this existing market arrangement provides enough incentives to promote entry in the generation and retail segment, that's another question that we need to answer. And I hope I have some answers to that as we move on.
Okay? That will be allowed also, because given it's so tight, the domestic market is very, the territory government own territory generation may not like to see that. Yeah, it's comfortable when you get into it.
Yeah, so.
And so that may not happen.
Yeah, so that may happen. Yes, that may happen with the changes in market rules. And what are those? I'll be talking about that. But thanks, that's a very good point. So.
Can I ask a question? Does the market allow you to be a generator and a retailer at the same time?
Generator and the retailer, yes. I mean, that is what is happening, right? So, I mean, you can, Jacana Energy is owned by the government, state-owned, and I mean, the government also owns the territory generation, right? So.
This is quite different, just to clarify. So, Jacana and territory generation are independent boards, and it's current order. And under the separation, territory generation can't be a gen table as they call it, with 5 years from separation. So
right.
Under the legislation, we are allowed to be
so that's the legal separation, right? So, yeah, okay.
But that's not stopping private people coming in and becoming income.
That's right.
Government may not like that. Because, power generation, territory generation, that is our one way to implement government.
Yeah.
So the government doesn't want to do that.
Through
Right. Okay, so if you have any specific questions on that, we have the right people in the panel, okay? So, all right, so, and this is the other aspect of the NT market is it's a small market, as we all are very scattered. You can see, the blue lines are the transmission lines. So there is a direct interconnection between Catherine and Darwin at the moment, and that's the only interconnection we have, right? And there are other, the consumption centers at other urban centers like Tennant Creek, Alice Springs. Yeah, they are not connected, like interconnected again. And the red lines are the distribution lines. Again, they are very scattered. The green rectangles are the power station owned by Power and Water Corporation, while what's the color? The yellowish rectangle are the power stations owned by independent power producers, right? So, is that right? Because there is a power purchase agreement between.
The green ones there are independent power producers, the other ones are mostly owned by territory generation and some are owned by
Then I think there is a mistake in this diagram. So this map is a mistake. I mean, I got it from Power and Water, so thanks for pointing that out. And that makes sense too, because I mean, I think territory generation has just contracted 114 megawatts, something around that, from the IPPs, right?
So separation or another community. Also regulated markets of Darwin, Catherine, Tennant Creek, Alice Springs. We also operate in Mara, Tennant Creek, and there's a number of
Right.
use agreements within those regions.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks. All right. Now, the another aspect of the NT market is the remote and indigenousness of it, with abundant solar potential. The dwellings in NT has had solar installed in 2013, which is the lowest among all states and territories, despite a daily average of 9 hours of sunshine each day of the year. I mean, we are very aware about that, right? So what is currently happening is around 72 remote indigenous communities and 66 homelands in the territory are served by essential services. So where is this leading us to? We have around 177 diesel power generators powering around 56 island power stations, using over 30 million liters of diesel per year. So that's the state. So also more than 50% of the population in the territory is not connected to the grid. I mean, in that sense, reforms will produce minimal effect to these communities at the start, because the reforms are mainly centered around the Darwin, Catherine markets. Sorry, did you want to comment on something?
That last line, 50% of the population is not connected to the grid. Yeah. There's what, 250,000 people living in the territory, you're saying 120,000 are not connected to the grid. I find that very hard for you to believe.
Okay, I mean, I got this from an informal source, but thanks for pointing that out. I will certainly recheck. But I mean, there is a significant amount of population that is off-grid, right? You do agree with that?
Oh yeah, but they're small.
Okay.
The big major centres are Darwin, Catherine, Tennant Creek, all the Alice Springs, and you've got 80% of the population there.
Okay.
And they're definitely on the grid.
All right, okay, thanks. Okay, so what's the gap in the literature? What are we trying to contribute? If you look at the studies on small electricity systems all over the world, they are very limited. There was a pioneering study by a guy called Bacon in 1995 who suggested the need for intermediate reform options for countries with too small power systems. So his idea was that a radical competitive reforms of a small energy market may not be desirable in the short term. Instead, it has to be a phased process, And then in 2001, Milan and Vives concluded that the implementation of competitive reforms in small power markets are difficult, and hence focus should be towards an integrated market. That is, you first expand your market, make the market bigger, and then implement competitive reforms so that the gains are maximized, okay? And then another study by Perez and Ramos Rial in 2008 concluded that vertical industry structure and the design of the grid operator and its attributes are the key features for the efficient operation of any market, be it large or small, okay? And then I did a study in 2012 on small energy markets in developing countries, and the conclusion from our study was that the creation of an independent regulatory authority is more important than vertical separation of the market, for example, okay? So this study is actually advancing knowledge and policy gap in small markets with scattered networks serving low density load, touching aspects of remoteness and indigenousness, okay? And this is globally relevant because there are many small island economies in the Asia Pacific, Southeast Asia, and the Caribbean where the reforms are ongoing, and there is an immense need to decarbonize their economy. So there is there are potentials for these markets to learn from what's happening elsewhere. Okay, so that's how I'm selling my work here. All right. So, okay, so let's look at some of the statistics around some interesting diagrams and so forth. So this particular chart is showing you the fuel mix in different markets in the NAM and the Western Australia market. Okay, so both of these markets are heavily dominated by fossil fuels, electricity generation across all markets. In fact, in the NAM it's mostly black and brown coal generating 74% of the electricity. In Western Australia it's gas and coal. Okay, gas 43%, coal 49%, and in NT it's gas has been the dominant source because of the discovery of the large reserves both onshore and offshore since 1986, right? And I think gas is the fuel that sits between coal and the renewables, right? Because gas is the intermediate solution towards the long-run transition to a low-carbon economy, and this will likely to stay so as we witness an increase in carbon price, which actually increases the relative cost of diesel and coal. Okay, so, and if you look at the installed capacity, which is an indicator of system size, I mean the NAM is gigantic. It's like 50,000 megawatt of installed capacity. Western Australia around 6,100 megawatt or so, and in NT the on-grid installed capacity is around 700 megawatt. Am I right in saying that? Right. Yeah, and this is, I mean, I come from Nepal, and we also have around an installed capacity of around 700, 800 megawatt, you know, so certain attributes are quite comparable. And of course, I mean, there is this issue of remote electrification and so in developing countries, which is also the same in PNT context. So I think there can be a lot of learnings here. Okay, and this chart shows you the wholesale electricity prices across these three markets. I mean, I've just picked a particular month of May 2016, because that was when I was probably writing this paper, and you know, I just stick with the month. The idea is not to do a comparison, but just to capture some characteristics, you know, of these three markets. I mean, these prices are actually determined every half hour. Okay, so they are determined on a half-hourly basis. For a particular day, I averaged the 48 half-hourly prices and obtained the daily average. Okay. And why I did that? Because I think comparing half-hourly prices are even more problematic given the time differences and so forth, right? I mean, half-hourly prices are very spiky. So I just to facilitate a bit of a discussion, I mean, stuck with the average daily prices. And you can see that the NAM, which is the National Electricity Market, it demonstrates, I mean, large movements in its price. There's a lot of fluctuation, right? I mean, and then the Western Australia market, and the territory market, I mean, the prices are relatively stable as compared to the NAM. However, the average daily wholesale prices, the mean, the monthly mean is actually the highest in the NT than the other two markets at the moment. And let me tell you, these are the prices. These prices are not yet used for financial settlements. Okay, these are the virtual prices in the case of NT, because as I told you earlier, given the interim market we have, the generators and the retailers, they still sign bilateral contracts at an agreed price. And yeah. Any questions?
I didn't even know this was published.
Oh yeah, well that's the whole point. I mean, with the commencement of actually responsible for publishing these market data, you know. So yeah.
So how are they? So
But given that there's not a lot of transparency on the cost of production,
Yeah, okay.
well, perhaps the cost of delivery.
Yeah.
So, okay. So this is just that the generator terminals.
Yes, well, I mean, this somehow improves the wholesale market transparency, right? I mean, you have some price information that's available, and also on the retail side, we do now know how much, to whom we are paying our bills to, for example. That's another aspect of transparency, let's say. So, yeah, so, yeah, but obviously, as I told you, and I repeat, this is just an interim market, and the prices are not used for financial settlements like what is happening in energy-only prices. So in the absence of market power and any other strategic support such as capacity payments, these prices should reveal the cost of electricity generation. Okay? Okay, and also, I mean, in the name and the Western Australia electricity market, they have the provisions of the maximum price and the minimum price. So maximum price means price cannot rise above that level, let's say at times of reduced baseload capacity or capacity constraints. And also if it's about triggering, I mean, power outages, then price will eventually strike that level. On the other hand, negative prices will allow negative bidding. That is, if certain generators are too costly to turn off, then, you know, negative prices will allow their operation. Yes, please.
So just with the Northern Territory figures, were they published before May 2016?
No, this is no. This yeah. Well, this has been this is being published since May 2015 with the commencement of the market operators, and because that's one of the tasks of the market operator, you know, and that's how, I mean, the market transparency is, you know, improved. So. Any other questions around it? Okay. And let's look at the components of residential electricity prices, which is what matters to us, you know. So, broadly speaking, the amount we are paying per megawatt of the electricity we consume is governed by three specific components, okay? The first one is the wholesale and retail costs, which are the competitive contestable segments of the electricity supply industry, okay? And then you have the regulated network costs, which is basically the cost of, I mean, using the wires to transport the electricity from the source to the final consumers, right? And then you have the environmental policy costs, okay? So in the case of NT, you can see that wholesale and retail costs are still very significant as compared to the other two markets. So that's the whole debate about introducing reforms to promote competition and reduce the cost in the contestable segments makes sense, okay? But if you look at the regulated network cost, it's still high, but it's lower than what you see in the name, for example, okay? Now, who determines the network cost? Is the regulator. I mean, the electricity industry is a very interesting industry because you have, if you look across the chain, you have both competitive segments and a natural monopoly segment. So now the wires and the poles, these are the natural monopoly segments. Why natural monopoly? Let's say we have a new building here at the Casuarina campus. Does it make sense for us to actually construct a whole new transmission and distribution line, connect that extra building? Of course not. It's very easier and convenient and economic to connect it to the existing, right, poles and wires. So that's why it's a natural monopoly segment, and it's regulated to prevent any price manipulation and so, okay? So broadly speaking, in Australia, household prices have increased by 61% between 2008 and 2014, despite the drop in energy uses. Have been the rising network costs, okay, especially in the NEM, because network costs have more than doubled since 2007. So what indeed happened was there was huge investments in transformers and other transmission assets. And with the fall in demand, now these assets are lying idle. But who is actually paying for those costs? It's the consumers. That's just an example, okay? So, yeah, so that's the different components. So competitive reforms are expected to bring down the wholesale and retail costs, while effective regulation is responsible for bringing down the regulated net costs, thereby reducing the bill that, thereby reducing the end user electricity bill, okay? Now the next indicator is to look at different energy losses across these markets. You can see that electricity losses in the territory market is around 9%, which is also relatively higher compared to a much larger market like the NEM, which exhibits a 10% loss. And in the WEM, the energy losses is around 6.7%. Now we have a mix of overhead and underground cables in the territory. Overhead cables are prone to the vulnerability and safe supply of energy. Underground cables might be the way, but they are capital intensive, they are expensive. So any investments in underground cabling will eventually be passed on to the consumers, okay? So, all right, and okay, so that's the state of the market. We also got a glimpse on how the market is performing across different dimensions, right? So considering that reforms are ongoing and the territory is looking at markets elsewhere to learn, there are different pathways that we have proposed that could be forward, for our benefit, okay? So the first policy option that we have proposed is to promote entry in electricity generation and retail. So economic theory is very clear on this. Wholesale prices will be closer to competitive levels under sufficient number of competing generators and adequate spare capacity, okay? However, the anti-generation is dominated by territory generation, which has also contracted, 14.5 megawatt of electricity from IPPs, the independent power producers. In the retail side, Jacana Energy is the dominant supplier retailer across for all consumption labels. Now, the developments in retail price competition for small consumers commenced on 1st August 2015, sorry about the typo, in Darwin-Catherine region, okay? So for small consumers, the prices are no longer regulated. So that means the market is open for any independent retailer to jump into and start serving the customers, right? So there are no subsidized or regulated prices in Darwin-Catherine region. And the same thing happened in Alice Springs and Tennant Creek from 1st January 2016, but with a declining subsidy to actually prevent a major price increase because of the lifting of the subsidies, So subsidies basically suppress the price. Now, if you are talking about competitive pricing, you lift the subsidy, so that will raise the price, to what a market would determine. So, but that might be very, harmful for a consumer in terms of consumption smoothing or so, So that's why there is a declining subsidy in the Alice Springs and Tennant Creek market. Now, the full retail contestability was imposed in 2010, but nothing has been done in the context of large consumers, so there is a big question mark at the moment. And the next thing is, okay, fine, entry is good, but how do we promote entry in the electricity generation segment, So the answers we have are quite straightforward. Let's change the existing market rules. And the first is, let's reduce the complexity in trading arrangements. Now, one way to do that would be allow the IPPs to sign long-term contracts directly with retailers and not through, power and water, so to speak. And the next change in market rule that we propose is providing incentives for generators to participate in the market. That is, for paying generators for making their capacity available, like capacity payments. I had a meeting with the NT Department of Treasury and Finance on the reform issues in the NT context, and they told me that the capacity payments are something that the Treasury is considering in the longer term. Okay.
So if you study in Western Australia,
Yeah. But they have a separate market for that. So
it still sort of results in an incentive for you to own large generators and then use them in a narrow area or something.
yes, I'm not surprised. We're talking about a network industry, so regulation and all these other kind of things. Things have to be complemented. And then encouraging non-discriminatory access to the grid. So for example, in the current arrangement, I think it's important that we replace the system controller role of power and water with an independent system operator, for example. Okay, so I hope you'll agree with me.
My understanding is that any independent power producer can sign up with a retailer now.
Oh, really? So,
And the system controller does have a set of rules that they have some discretion to
okay. So in that sense, those rules can be, made simple, and the constraints can be minimized in that sense. Okay. Now the next option we have proposed is the need for intra-regional market expansion, because theory is very clear. Competitive reforms will only engender benefits in bigger markets. Okay. So if you look at the way the NT market is moving, the idea is to eventually integrate with the national electricity market in the future, because that's where the rules harmonizations are taking place. Now we say, hey, let's take a full stop here. How about first interconnecting with other urban centers within the territory, and then moving forward. So this is what we propose. So long-term goals would be to connect urban centers of Darwin, Captain and Creek and Alice Springs. Okay. And the third option is about effective network regulation. All these competitive reforms in network industries, they were implemented with the underlying principle of competition where feasible, regulation were not. So how efficient, how effective your regulatory framework and the underlying regulatory regime is determines a lot of outcome in the market. So with reforms in the NT, that has signaled a shift of the regulatory burden from the Utilities Commission to the AER. However, the AER is not perfect. We did a paper in 2014, which is published in Energy Policy, where we actually tackle the different problems and constraints that the AER is actually facing. So if we go by the international evidence, efficiency gains to consumers in liberalized city markets largely depends on the underlying regulatory regime. Okay. And last but not the least, it's about promoting solar. But how? One way is hiking the regulated feed-in tariff to reflect higher value of solar versus diesel, including its environmental benefits and potential savings by postponing costly network expansions, right? So I think at the moment, if you supply electricity to the grid, you get paid the same amount you pay while buying electricity from the grid. So this can be changed. If grid, that rate can go up. This is what we are suggesting.
The commercial customers, they're not allowed to export.
Right, it's just the households, right? Yeah. And then minimizing cost of PV installations such as building permits, which currently cost $1,000. This is too much, so when we are living under credit crunch. So. And then, of course, if financial barriers exist in the remote and indigenous communities, I mean, there is a need to overcome that. There is a big literature on microfinance and cooperative financing model, which has worked in the context of developing countries. So maybe this is something that one can look at, right? And then establishing formal climate policies, emissions reduction targets, or specific plans to harness renewable resources, which is completely missing in the current context. So after all, we are talking about comparing the cost of diesel generation with a carbon price. Let's say $23, it's an ad hoc price. If you are asking me why $23, please talk to my co-author, okay? And he is still expected to be higher than solar with small diesel backup, but needs estimating, okay? So that's one thing we need to look at. So all in all, reforms do not address the renewable energy agenda and may mean missing the opportunity of becoming a world leader in providing green energy in remote areas, okay? So now what are the implications of the different policy options we have proposed? Let's look at this simple graph. Why does it matter for consumers like us? With policy option A and B, we expect the wholesale and retail cost to go down because there will be more competition. And with policy option C, the regulated network cost will go down. So overall, we'll see a shrinking of the bill, okay? And yes, to conclude, in liberalized electricity markets, consumer is the boss while the regulator is the king. So a lot depends on the underlying regulatory regime and the efficiency of the regulator, because now the fate of the market largely hinges on the regulator. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.